Hello, Bitcoin Alive. I hope you're all having a good day. I certainly am, and it's been amazing meeting so many inspiring people here today and hearing some amazing talks before me. As Dale already said, AMP became the first superannuation fund to invest into Bitcoin last year. And for us, it was a really big move, but I think it's also a big move for the industry. So today I want to tell you about how we actually went about making this investment and why, if you approach it correctly, it doesn't need to be a super scary or risky investment, but it can actually be really risk responsible as well. The presentation is split up into 5 parts. So first, I'll talk to you about how we invested into Bitcoin. Then I'll give a quick shout out to the people behind the decision, because it wasn't just me. I actually played a minor role in it, I would say. Why we decided to add Bitcoin, and then zoom out a little bit and talk more generally about how Bitcoin fits into investment portfolios. And then I'll finish off with some concluding thoughts going forward. So how did we actually invest into Bitcoin? The way that we invested in Bitcoin is through what's called a dynamic asset allocation, DAA for short. This is basically just a basket of trading strategies for diverse asset classes, including commodities, equities, currencies, bonds, and in our case, Bitcoin. The way that we construct this basket of strategies is that we combine investment strategies that are quite uncorrelated to each other with the goal to really maximize the Sharpe ratio for a given risk target in this basket. We also invest mainly through futures, which is what we've done for Bitcoin as well. And the way that the allocation within this basket works is that based on the investment strategies, we can dial the exposure to any asset class up or down, depending on how favorable our models think the market currently is. So the Bitcoin exposure that we have, the 27 million, is not stable at 27 million. It can go up and down depending on what our model thinks about the market. The way that this looks is that at AMP we manage a lot of different superannuation funds, and there are a lot of different funds that actually have exposure to this DAA basket, and not all of our funds have exposure to it as well. But what that means is that the 27 million that Dale just mentioned is actually split up over many different funds. For a fund that has an exposure to Bitcoin, what this looks like is roughly something like this. This is for illustrative purposes only, but the fund will generally have exposure to equities, bonds, credit, property, alts, and a little bit of cash. And this DAA basket will sit in that fund as an overlay. And it'll generally be a really small allocation. And within this small allocation, a small allocation of that will be to Bitcoin. Which is why when you actually sum up all of the funds under management that we have, that's roughly 57 billion in total. And 27 million of that are invested into Bitcoin, which is 0.05% of funds under management. So as Dale just mentioned, or as James said this morning, we probably haven't even dipped a toe in the water. It's probably a hair of the small toe that we've dipped into the water. But we've made the move. We've gotten off zero, which is the key point here. Now, before I talk about why we invested into Bitcoin, I actually want to give a shout out to the people that were most instrumental in this decision. At AMP, we have an amazing investment team, and there were a lot of people involved in making this decision, but there's arguably 2 people that were most instrumental, which are Anna Shelley, our CIO, and Stuart Elliott, our head of portfolio management. Stuart is actually in the crowd here today wearing a Bitcoin t-shirt as well. But the reason why I bring this up as well is that one thing I want to highlight here is that Stuart and Anna came into making this decision with different backgrounds in respects to Bitcoin. Stuart had invested into Bitcoin many years ago himself and had a lot of prior knowledge and conviction in regards to Bitcoin. Anna also had a good understanding of Bitcoin, but it was more high level and maybe more from a portfolio management perspective. But, and this is the key point, she's an amazing CIO, and one of the things that makes her so great is that she's open to embracing innovation and open to investing in new technologies when they show strong future potential and align with our members' best interest, which is really the key point here. Not everybody involved in making this decision, especially at a high level, has to be an absolute expert in Bitcoin, but what's more important is that you're forward-thinking and open to embracing innovation, which is really what Anna embodies. So why did we decide to invest into Bitcoin? The first thing I want to mention here is that when you think about in the environment of a superannuation fund, if you want to successfully embrace a new technology or innovation, there are arguably 4 key pillars that you have to consider and combine in order to be able to do it successfully. The first one is acting in your members' best interest. At a superannuation fund, we invest people's retirement money. So we know we have to invest with a degree of safety and conservatism. But at the same time, we have a duty to our members. When they invest their money with us, they are outsourcing their investment decisions that are supposed to plan for their retirement to us. And with that, they're trusting us to stay on top of new emerging technologies and to invest in these for them if it's in their best interest. The second one is being responsible. We have to manage risk responsibly, and this means moving slow and not breaking things, which, by the way, is how Bitcoin moves as well. But it also means moving, not standing still. The third one is to be forward-thinking. Because we're investing for the long run, and for people like me who are still quite young, you want to compound over decades, you also have to invest into assets with decades of time horizons. But what it also means is that when we form an informed opinion on something, we're not afraid to act on it, even if it goes against the industry consensus. And the fourth and final pillar here is to keep an open mind. The willingness to change one's mind, especially when new information comes in, is critically important in the investment space. And what that meant for us is that just because we formed a certain opinion on Bitcoin in 2020, let's say, that doesn't mean that we can't re-evaluate that opinion from first principles in 2024 when new information comes in, when the ETFs launch, when the regulatory environment becomes more clear, and when other institutions are already embracing Bitcoin. We actually went back to first principles and said, okay, let's re-evaluate that at this point in time. Now, keeping this lens in mind, these four key pillars, let's actually look at the timeline of the past 14 months to put our decision-making into perspective as well. The first thing that happened, and probably the most important thing that happened in the beginning of last year, was that the Bitcoin spot ETFs launched. Shortly thereafter, we in the investment team actually began evaluating whether Bitcoin in our portfolios would make sense, and if so, how we would do it. While we went through a rigorous process of doing due diligence, doing backtesting, talking to different stakeholders, and really figuring this out, we also saw a few things happen along the way. IBIT, within 6 or 7 weeks of the ETF launching, became the most successful ETF to launch in the past decade, and it reached $10 billion in assets under management faster than any other ETF ever had. We also saw when the 13F filings came out that hedge funds, asset management firms, and even banks were already buying Bitcoin through the ETF. And one thing that was really interesting for us was that the Wisconsin Pension Fund in the US actually announced investing more than $160 million into Bitcoin through the ETF. Shortly after that, in early May of last year, we actually then decided to go live with our Bitcoin DAA at AMP, roughly at a Bitcoin price somewhere in the mid-60,000s. But what this also shows is that even from the time that we started evaluating this to the time that we actually went live, we spent 3.5 months going through really rigorous processes of evaluating this to see whether it actually makes sense to include this in the funds for our members. And we came to the conclusion that in a small allocation, dynamically managed, it does. Then we saw other things happen, like Senator Lummis introducing the Bitcoin Reserve Bill in the US. The SEC approved BlackRock's spot Bitcoin ETF options listing. Russia launched a BRICS mining infrastructure project. Trump was elected president, and obviously with him, we have the first pro-Bitcoin, pro-crypto president and really pro-Bitcoin administration. We just saw a Bitcoin Strategic Reserve announced yesterday. The UK pension fund allocated roughly 3% to Bitcoin. We also saw the FASB fair value accounting rules change at the end of last year. MicroStrategy was included in the NASDAQ 100. And Russia announced using Bitcoin in foreign trade on Boxing Day as of last year. So by the time we got to the end of last year, we actually saw roughly a 50% return on our Bitcoin investment just in 2024 alone. So just between May and December, we saw roughly a 50% return. Obviously, because the allocation is so small, that doesn't necessarily move the needle a lot, but it still moves it a bit. And for us, this was really a proof of concept that when you go about making a decision like this in a really rational, responsible way, and you decide to be a bit bold and to embrace a new technology, even if the rest of the industry doesn't, it can totally pay off. And this is exactly what we saw. We then also saw that the SEC rescinded SAB 121 in early 2025, and that the Czech central bank is now considering holding Bitcoin as a reserve. Now, the one thing I'm missing here is obviously the strategic Bitcoin reserve in the US, because I created these slides before that happened, but that would have definitely been mentioned on here as well. Now, Stuart and I were actually reflecting on this whole decision as I was preparing for this presentation, and one thing that we both agreed on is that it was almost like we had the right team at the right place at the right time in order to make this happen. Because we already had a systematic DAA in place. We also had rigorous research and governance frameworks in place, and we were already trading commodities, including gold. So the step from already trading gold to trading digital gold wasn't a big one, but for funds that don't have a way to get exposure to gold and trade it in the way that we already did at the time, going straight to Bitcoin is probably a bigger leap. We also had members in the investment team with a deep understanding of Bitcoin and a leadership team open to innovation. So because those 5 conditions came together in one team at AMP, I think that's what really allowed us to make this happen. Okay, now let me take some time and zoom out a little bit and talk about how I think people should be thinking about Bitcoin's role in investment portfolios in general, in diversified portfolios. Arguably, the best case for Bitcoin in a diversified portfolio is as a unique diversifier. And BlackRock actually released a paper last year called Bitcoin a Unique Diversifier, which is a really good paper. And one of the things that I show on this slide here is that when you actually look at the correlation between Bitcoin and gold and the S&P 500 over time, which is what the top chart on this slide shows, you can see that both Bitcoin and gold move through different phases of being slightly positively correlated, slightly negatively correlated, and quite uncorrelated to equities. And over a long period of time, both are really uncorrelated to equities. The bottom chart shows the same just for Bitcoin versus the S&P, Bitcoin versus gold, and Bitcoin versus bonds. But what that means is that over the long-term horizon, Bitcoin is really uncorrelated to the assets that you typically find in an investment portfolio. And when you think about why that's the case, it really makes sense, because if Bitcoin is this global, decentralized, fixed supply, non-sovereign asset, you would expect it to have distinct risk and return drivers to other assets, and therefore it should be fundamentally uncorrelated long-term. Now, I'll come back to why this is important in a second. But the first thing I want to address here is that one criticism that we often hear is that Bitcoin is too risky, it's too volatile. It's one thing that we hear in our industry a lot, but you hear it all over the world. I think there were some senators in the US literally rejecting their state's proposal for a Bitcoin reserve because of this very argument. The first thing I would like to say here is that yes, Bitcoin is volatile, but when you think about from first principles what Bitcoin is trying to be, a new global monetary alternative, and where it currently is in its stage of monetization and how monetary goods usually monetize, which is they start off as collectibles, move to stores of value, and only once something is a stable store of value does it become a medium of exchange and a unit of account. Where we currently are with Bitcoin most likely is it's moving from a collectible to a store of value. But not a lot of people see it as a store of value yet, and it's far from being a stable store of value. And while this happens, you would expect it to be super volatile, especially if there's financial crises along the way, wars along the way, governments are trying to ban it, and there's a lot of uncertainty around what Bitcoin actually is. But what you would also expect is that this volatility goes down over time as more and more people figure out what it actually is and more people start to adopt it, which is exactly what you see when you actually plot the rolling volatility of Bitcoin over time. It has been coming down a lot, and you would expect this to decrease further as adoption increases. The second thing I would like to say regarding the volatility is that if you actually compare the volatility of Bitcoin to stocks like Tesla and Nvidia, which Bitcoin is in the orange line here and Tesla is in the red line and Nvidia is the green line here, you can see that starting in July 2022, Bitcoin hasn't actually been any more volatile than Tesla or Nvidia, and it's roughly been in the same range of volatility. So criticizing AMP's investment of 0.05% into Bitcoin because of its volatility, but not criticizing an investment in something like the MSCI World at a small allocation because of its volatility of Nvidia actually doesn't really make a lot of sense, because Nvidia makes up 4% of the MSCI World. So a 1.4% allocation to the MSCI World gives you roughly the same volatility from Nvidia as a 0.05% allocation to Bitcoin does in a diversified portfolio. And the reason that this is important is that in portfolio management, especially in a diversified portfolio, we never consider an asset in isolation. So criticizing one asset for being too volatile really misses the point of portfolio theory. What matters is how it interacts with other assets in the portfolio, so the correlation. And the interesting thing here is that if an asset is fundamentally uncorrelated to the rest of the portfolio, which I just showed earlier Bitcoin is over the long term, then volatility is actually something you want, as long as the volatility is to the upside, so as long as the expected return is positive. Because if that's the case, then what happens when you add it to a portfolio is the following. Here, I've just modeled the typical 60-40 portfolio and added a 1, 2, and 3% allocation to Bitcoin from 2014 to early 2025. And what you can see is with each additional percent invested into Bitcoin, the return actually goes up quite a bit. But the interesting and the key part here is that the annualized volatility barely moves between a 0% allocation to Bitcoin and a 3% allocation to Bitcoin. So as a result of that, the risk-adjusted return, or the Sharpe ratio, also only increases. And why that happens is because, yes, Bitcoin has been super volatile, but at a small allocation, because it's so uncorrelated to the rest of this portfolio, the volatility basically gets diversified away, and all that you're left with is the additional return that it provided over that time period. Now, one thing that occurred to me as I was preparing for this presentation is that there's actually a fundamental philosophical alignment between superannuation and sound money, or specifically Bitcoin, which is the philosophy of a low time preference. When you think about, on one hand, what superannuation tries to do is we set aside capital until retirement, and we invest into assets with long-term horizons and try to compound returns over decades. In the case of superannuation, regulation is what enforces the long-term thinking, because you get punished for trying to take your money out of superannuation. But on the other side, you have Bitcoin, or sound money in general, but specifically Bitcoin here, with a fixed supply cap and monetary policy. And once you've been in Bitcoin long enough and you truly understand what it is and how scarce it is and how your purchasing power tends to go up over time when you hold Bitcoin long enough, you start to value future purchasing power over immediate consumption. And in Bitcoin's case, the non-inflationary monetary system is what encourages long-term thinking. So on one hand, you've got superannuation, where long-term thinking is enforced through regulation. And on the other hand, you have sound money, or Bitcoin specifically, where long-term thinking is encouraged naturally by the properties of the money that you hold. But all in all, both of these are really aligned philosophically, because you need this low time preference and you need to think for the long term and plan for the long term. Now, some final concluding thoughts. What we will be doing at AMP going forward is we will continue to monitor the Bitcoin space and to keep an open mind. We will also continue to foster open dialogue, education, and informed decision-making. I've actually been running some educational sessions on Bitcoin at AMP, and we've been monitoring the market a lot, and there's a lot of people that now understand the difference between Bitcoin and crypto at AMP and really, really understand the investment case for Bitcoin, and there's very strong conviction within the investment team now. One thing that we are also doing, and I know a lot of you aren't going to like this, is we are evaluating and staying open to the potential of adding additional digital assets. Now, I think this is probably quite unlikely to happen anytime soon, but with the principle of keeping an open mind that I mentioned earlier, we will be keeping an open mind in regards to that as well. But as I already said, we make a clear separation between Bitcoin and crypto, and I think this is one of the key things here, is that we understand that Bitcoin's investment case is really this global monetary alternative and store of value, and adopting crypto would be more of a bet on blockchain adoption in general, and it's more like VC investing into early stage tech startups. And then the last thing that I would like to say here is that if we zoom out further and look at what's happening globally, we can see that the US is already embracing Bitcoin using well-defined guidelines, and other countries will likely follow. That's always what's happened in the past, especially if you look at the internet adoption or AI now. The US leads the way, everybody else kind of sits on the sidelines and then follows once the US has reaped all the benefits. But for me, this represents an opportunity for Australian superannuation funds and for Australia in general to participate and not just observe. So let's stop being so close-minded around this. Let's have open dialogues around what place Bitcoin has in the financial future of our members, and let's make an informed decision, not one out of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So let's be forward-thinking, and let's play our part in creating a prosperous future for Australians. Thank you, everyone.